It does feel kind of dumb to talk about a camera that's ridiculously hard to get your hands on, but we're gonna do it because, one, I think some people are just getting their hands on the X100VI they ordered months ago. Two, I think a few more are gonna hit the secondhand market if people discover it's not the camera for them. Three, while I'm discussing the X100VI and Sony A7 IV a lot in this video, you can apply a lot of what I'm saying to several Fujifilm cameras like the X-T5 or X-T50 and full-frame cameras like the Canon R6 Mark II and Nikon Z6 III. And four, this review is after 8 months of using the Fujifilm X100VI. So that is real use over a real amount of time in a lot of real scenarios to give you a real sense of what it's like to use this camera as a daily carry. Anyway, I got the X100VI not too long after its release, and I was super hyped to have it and use it all the time, and for months I did. I've taken a lot of photos with the Fujifilm X100VI, like a ton. It goes everywhere with me more than any other camera I've ever owned, and even better, it's been so easy to share those photos because most of the time I'm not doing any editing. Fujifilm's ability to create beautiful JPEG colors straight out of camera was a big selling point and still is one of my favorite features. But as someone who also owns full-frame cameras and loves that look as well, is the X100VI and its smaller APS-C sensor with a wide-angle f2 lens enough? Or is the added size of a full-frame camera and lens worth it for the superior image quality? We're going to discuss this from as many different angles as I can think of, with lots of photo examples to go along with it in this video. For years, I've used a healthy combination of iPhone Pro models and the Sony A7 IV, even the Sony A7S III before I sold it. And since the X100VI came out, I've added it to the mix and it's become my most used camera. These are all excellent cameras, I should say, but they're also all very different. Where we'll separate them in this video is which do I prefer for everyday use, which is most enjoyable to shoot with, which one is the easiest to use, what are some of the limitations, what's the reaction I get from photos from each of these cameras, and of course, what I think is considered most important, image quality from both a JPEG versus edited photos and full frame versus APS-C standpoint. And if you find this video helpful along the way, drop a like and hit that subscribe button because, well, these videos take work, and especially this one did take some work, so your support goes a long way. Also, like I said, for those of you here just for image examples from each camera, there are lots throughout this video, both side by side and individual shots in plenty of different scenarios. So let's start with size and design, because honestly, that's where the conversation begins and ends with the X100VI and what makes it such a unique camera compared to just about everything else on the market right now. Just looking at the X100, its retro styling and physical dials for aperture, ISO, and shutter speed really stand out, regardless of whether or not you actually use them. More on that in a second. Compared to the Sony A7 IV, which for the purposes of this video will have the 35mm G Master f1.4, it's a lot smaller. The pros are, it's a lot easier to bring everywhere, and I do mean almost literally everywhere. That includes the usuals like coffee shops, street photography on walks to work, and just hanging out with friends and family. I've also found it handy while hiking, at sporting events, nights out and parties, even some documentary photography. And to me, it's those things where size is a huge advantage. Unless it's a pancake lens, you usually can't take interchangeable lens cameras into events. In fact, at a Portland Trail Blazers game I went to recently, they specifically asked if it was a fixed lens camera to determine whether or not I could bring it into the arena. In terms of cons, there really aren't too many, if any at all. The small grip is less than ideal, but it's pretty light, so with a wrist strap or something that has a little extra security, it's not that bad to carry. Still, I do prefer using the added grip from SmallRig, which doesn't stick out any further than the length of the lens and still allows the camera to keep a pretty compact form. And maybe if they did make the camera's grip a little bigger, there could have been room for an extra SD card slot somewhere, but for how I think most people use this camera, that's not really too much of a deal breaker. The Sony A7 IV, on the other hand, is obviously a thicker, more modern camera. And while it's more noticeable than the X100 and draws more attention when using it in public, it's still not as bulky as the DSLRs of old. And for me, it's important to remember that prior to owning the X100VI, this was the camera that I brought everywhere, and I never had an issue doing so. The grip feels great, and it's easy to hold whether you're using a lens like the 35mm G Master or something larger. But especially when you're using some of the smaller lenses available, it's really a very comfortable camera to work with both professionally and casually. Still, the differences in design do matter. And maybe it's because I often use my A7 IV and other Sony cameras for client work, both for photo and video, but when people say it feels like a tool, it does. But again, so do most modern cameras with all of the buttons and dials and ergonomics that have been refined over time. They're designed to get the job done. The X100VI, on the other hand, is designed to capture your heart as well as capture photos. It just feels like a totally different experience to use this camera because it's much more of a casual looking camera, and though it can capture really great images, it just gives off a chill vibe, for lack of a better term. So the question is, does any of that matter to you? And to answer that, we've got to discuss how the design affects ease of use. The X100, because of its physical controls, puts all of the tools in front of you. So if you know what you're doing with the exposure triangle, it's easy and rewarding to many to dial in your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO to your liking physically with those dials. However, when I shoot in manual mode with the X100VI, I prefer mapping some of the exposure adjustments to the dials on the front and back of the right side of the camera, making it easy to adjust my shutter and ISO with my right thumb and index finger, and using the dial on the lens to change the aperture. And if you want to make things even simpler, you could just lock in a minimum shutter speed, which for me, I'd say is around 1/160th of a second. Pick the maximum for auto ISO, which I set to 6400, and just go with aperture priority mode and let the camera do most of the exposure work. Still, there is a downside with Fujifilm when it comes to ease of use, and that would be autofocus. That's where Sony steps into the conversation in a big way, and here's my reasoning. I'm behind the camera quite a bit, but there are times where I hand the camera off to someone else to take a picture of me with the family. And it's a lot easier to get a good result from a non-photographer when using the Sony because the autofocus is so much more reliable and so much quicker. Yes, Fujifilm's autofocus system is what I'd call good enough, and since I use it frequently, I've learned when I can use the eye autofocus versus when I should just turn it off and pick my own focus point instead. But when I'm giving the camera to someone else, they're just gonna take the camera and take the photo. And respectfully, you'd be surprised how many people don't recognize that the photo they just took is not in focus. And I don't think that's their fault, especially if they're not a photographer. Recently, I even missed focus myself when shooting in continuous autofocus at 6 frames per second. I actually didn't notice it until later that day when I was pulling the images off my SD card. When I hand someone my A7 IV though, I set the focus area to wide, have eye autofocus turned on, and it doesn't miss. Now I know this is a very niche situation, and if you're someone that's behind the camera most of the time, maybe you're not as worried about ease of use for others. But there's something to be said in terms of autofocus reliability and quickness and not missing the shot. And if you have the chance to use a Fujifilm camera alongside a recent Sony or Canon or Nikon camera, the difference in autofocus speed is really easy to see, and it will probably make you question whether or not the design and the look of the camera really matters when you're not able to capture images quite as quickly or efficiently. And I want to clarify just a little bit further. When I say capturing quickly or efficiently, when I press the shutter on my A7 IV or FX3 or formerly the A7S III, which shares a sensor with the FX3, look, I was not going to beat the autofocus to the picture being taken. Like, if I have my point set, if it's a clear enough, even in low light, just clear enough subject, it locks on, it takes it. I don't have to think twice. I press the shutter, I got it. With Fujifilm, you press the shutter, it's got to acquire that focus sometimes, even if it's a still subject. Like, there's just a little bit there that I think if you just straight up press the shutter down, you are going to potentially misfocus on that shot because it just hasn't had that little bit of time to gather focus and, you know, be a sharp image. It doesn't sound like a big deal. Most of the time, it's not a big deal. Again, I use this camera all the time, and I really do like the X100VI a lot, but it's just a little bit of a difference. And again, side by side with other cameras, you're gonna notice. But before we hand Sony the crown in terms of ease of use, we've got to talk about Fujifilm colors, JPEGs, and recipes, because this is the main reason I recommend Fujifilm cameras so much as the best choice for new photographers. You don't need to edit the photos for great results. And I define great results as an image that stands out more than the average smartphone photo. The highlights aren't blown out, it's not over sharpened, maybe there's a little bit of tasteful grain and bokeh. And with Fujifilm, all of those settings can be adjusted in camera and seen in the final output the second you press the shutter button. And with so many great recipes available with a huge online community, even a beginner can create really high quality photos, at least in terms of color. Case in point, a few years ago, I had a friend call me because they got their significant other a nice camera, a Canon EOS R, as a gift. But his question to me was, how do I use this to take a good photo for Instagram? That is obviously a loaded question and not one that you can easily answer. But I would say if you want an image that will look great, and if you make some tweaks unique for social media, I think that's most easily accomplished straight out of camera with Fujifilm. So who wins in terms of ease of use? Well, despite the autofocus that falls behind Sony, I've got to go with Fujifilm. For the photographer that knows what they're doing, the autofocus is fine, and it certainly hasn't bothered me enough to deter me from using the camera daily and getting really great results. The pipeline of taking the photo and sharing it is just so much shorter when you don't need to edit. In terms of the best for everyday use, I think that depends on the person. Again, prior to getting the X100VI, the A7 IV was my everyday camera, usually equipped with a 20mm or 35mm prime lens. And probably for the better, that's all I knew. That was my small kit. And again, zero complaints. I was just that guy that brought a nice full-frame camera everywhere he went. However, the X100VI does take that to another level because it's even smaller and less noticeable. It's unassuming in public, allowing me to bring a dedicated camera with me anywhere. It's been so easy to make this my daily carry because of its size, the control you have over the image quality, which we're gonna get to, and because I'm a dad now. So when you're carrying a diaper bag, a bottle bag, stroller, child, and anything else, it's nice not to have to think about the camera and its size. Just throw it over your shoulder or in any bag you've got lying around, and that's really all you need. Plus, despite what others have said, I find the battery life to be great for how I use it. I do take a lot of photos and some video on outings, but often I turn the camera off between shots if I'm out and about and walking around, so truly it checks all the boxes and everything I need for an everyday camera. And all of that is also what makes it the most enjoyable to use. I want to shoot with this camera all the time, whether it's because I want to try a different recipe in a certain location or experiment with some different in-camera looks, or because I'm just going out with my family and want to capture the moment. The most pleasant surprise is how much I've enjoyed hiking with the X100VI because of how small it is. Even as light as Sony's mirrorless cameras are, with a lens on them, you can get into some situations where it starts to dig into your hip or torso if it's on a neck strap. I honestly prefer rocking the Peak Design capture clip with my A7 IV if it's gonna be on me during a long outing. But with the X100VI, if I just hang it off my body, I really hardly notice it. No, you're not getting a full frame look, but I really don't have an issue with shooting and sharing these photos. Some of them straight out of camera, some edited, if it means a much more comfortable hiking experience. And the same can be said for most scenarios. When you really start shooting with the X100VI, you realize how much you appreciate the form factor. Until they put out a full-frame sensor in something this small without sacrificing the viewfinder, the dials, the buttons, and the ergonomics that make it a whole, fully featured camera, this is the best thing going at this size and capability if you don't mind the fixed lens, which is another conversation for another video. And since we did touch on it a bit there, it is time to talk about image quality. With such a unique camera like the X100VI, image quality has to be broken down into segments. So let's start with the most obvious for the sake of this comparison with the A7 IV, full frame versus APS-C. Sensor size. When it comes to working with raw files, a lot does depend on how you edit and your style, but if you're going for depth and that 3D look where you can feel the picture, exactly what you can get from a full frame image, you're not always going to get that with an APS-C camera. And you're also going to be relying a little bit more on light. That's just the facts. Especially indoors in below average light with the Fujifilm X100VI, I'm often pushing to my personal limit of ISO 6400. And at that point, the image can start to fall a bit flat and muddy. Where the X100VI makes up for that is with its flash, which I think is underrated, and I've started using quite a bit more, sometimes even outdoors in the sun if my subject is in the shadows. The added light from the camera's flash does plenty to pop your subject out, and certainly if you're going to be editing the raw image, you have the flexibility to balance out the exposure between the background and the foreground and your subject however you'd like to in post. On the other hand, with my A7 IV, and this is also with the help of a prime lens that can shoot at f1.4, I can keep my ISO much lower, around 2000 to 4000 in similar bad lighting. In any case, there's just more texture and detail in an image that, like I said, you can feel or that just looks more real, whether it's the color or the contrast or the texture, whatever. It's just different from a full frame sensor. And to that point, let's take a look at some side-by-sides. These photos from the park were taken back-to-back with the X100VI and A7 IV. Both have 35mm equivalent lenses, both had Polar Pro's everyday mist filter on the lens, both were shot with auto white balance in camera with the same color temperature adjustments made in post. Both were edited with the same adjustments made in Lightroom using the Adobe Color Profile. Again, to show you just kind of what you can do with each one and trying to get them to match as much as possible, so results may vary if you're a better editor than I am. In photos where I shot the X100VI wide open at f2, I stopped the A7 IV down to f2.8 to compensate for APS-C being about a stop and some change slower, though I probably should have gone down to f3.2 to get a little bit closer, but the point here is more to see the capabilities of a full-frame camera versus crop sensor, and if you do have a full-frame camera, you're probably going to spend a bit of time shooting those bright aperture lenses wide open at f2.8 or even lower. Anyway, this one with the log is a pretty good example of what I was just talking about. With the Sony stop down to f2.8, the bokeh background blur, it's pretty similar, but when we zoom in, the details on the log get a lot softer on the Fuji versus the Sony. Even looking behind the log, the leaves and the shadows, it just looks cleaner on the A7 IV. And bear in mind, this is a 40 megapixel sensor on the Fuji versus 33 megapixels on the Sony, so megapixels are not everything. Now, is there a chance the Fujifilm missed focus a little bit on the log? Maybe, but I think from that distance, even at f2, everything should just be a little bit more in focus, maybe a little bit sharper. Looking at another side-by-side, this shot of the church across the street, this is an example of can you even tell the difference? So let's do that. Pause this video, take your best guess, and yeah, Fujifilm is on the left and Sony is on the right. But let's take the gloves off for a second and not try to compensate the full frame sensor to make up for what the APS-C is lacking. Look at these side-by-side shots of the leaves. This is another one that's hard to tell apart, right? We've got the Sony A7 IV on the left and the X100VI on the right. The A7 IV is shot at f2.8, the X100 at f2, in order to keep the aperture between the two cameras and their different sensor sizes looking similar. But let's see what happens when we compare to the Sony at f1.4 instead. Now we have a subject that's separated from the background a whole lot more, and this is a part of the power of a full-frame sensor. Here's one more that's less obvious, but still a clear demonstration. Sony at f2.8 on the left, Fujifilm at f2 on the right. The Irving Park sign is the subject. When we use the shot of the Sony at f1.4 instead, look how much more it stands out from the background. Yes, again, the difference in lenses does matter here, probably just as much as the camera, but that's all part of it. If you go full frame, you have access to better glass, whether it's the Sony or Sigma Art lineup. And I don't know if this is fair to compare the X100VI, which is a fixed lens camera, to like an entire full frame lineup's worth of lenses that get a lot brighter, they're a lot bigger, they have a lot more glass. But I just want to give a clear example, especially because I do think there are a lot of full frame shooters who really want the X100VI. I just want you to know like what you're stepping into, what you're getting, and kind of the image you're going to get versus what you may have otherwise gotten shooting with your full frame kit instead. Plus, look, if you're financially on the fence between full frame or APS-C cameras and this difference in bokeh or definition at a pixel peeping level isn't a big deal to you, well, maybe you have your answer with what to go with. Let me know in the comments if sensor size is really this much of a deal breaker for you. And also remember, this is all subjective, and it really comes down to how you feel about your photos and your work. Personally, I have an affinity for both of these styles and both of these cameras. And where the X100VI has its next advantage is straight out of camera color with its JPEGs, and the ones from the part that didn't require editing were ready to share right away. Again, this is where Fujifilm has really taken off among so many people the last few years. The variety of looks you can get straight out of camera is incredible. I think the hook that reels us in is the ability to simulate film. The debate is ongoing whether or not it actually looks like film, but regardless, the camera menus do make it pretty straightforward to dial in the base simulation like a classic chrome or classic negative or many others, and then further tweak the image from there in terms of white balance, tint, contrast, saturation, grain, and more. I'll make a video on some of my favorite recipes, but the point is, the film recipes and colors make this camera a lot of fun to use. And when you really dive into the Fujifilm community, seeing new recipes shared and applying them to your own photos can give you that new camera feeling every time you pick it up, and it actually is pretty addicting. No, the ability to change color profiles in camera is not unique to Fujifilm. The Nikon ZF has some pretty attractive color profiles that can be applied to JPEGs, and really any modern mirrorless camera should allow you to go into the settings and tweak white balance and black levels and sharpness and things like that. Shoot, the Lumix S9 allows you to bake in user-created LUTs to the image. But no one's doing it quite like Fujifilm yet, and certainly there's not the huge Fujifilm community that's been built over the years with a lot of these other brands. Yet. Not to mention, sometimes the color I'm getting out of the X100VI JPEGs is better than what I'd do myself in an edit. Like this one of my daughter on a morning walk to get some coffee. I don't even know what I'd do differently. I shot it with the flash on, got nice exposure on her, nicely exposed background, works for me, share it to socials, move on. Outside of creating masks and the more complex adjustments that you can make in a program like Lightroom, you can do so much in camera to get the image you like. And going back to the camera flash that I mentioned earlier, this is where that plays a big role too, and why I think this X100VI is just so well thought out. The flash plus image stabilization can help mitigate issues that would otherwise need to be addressed while editing, especially with a smaller sensor. Plus, if you shoot in JPEG plus RAW, you can quickly make adjustments in camera. So, no need to make any changes once the photo goes from the memory card to your phone or computer. It's one thing to make a fixed lens point and shoot camera that takes good images that may require a little work in post, but it's a whole nother thing, if that's a word, to give the camera all the tools necessary to make editing completely unnecessary. That said, if you do prefer an editing workflow, shooting JPEG plus RAW means you can always take the raw images into Lightroom and apply your own profiles and presets, or use the camera matching profiles. Like, for example, you can take a photo captured with the classic chrome simulation and edit it from a classic negative simulation instead, giving it an entirely different look that will still feel distinctly Fujifilm. Personally, I prefer shooting JPEGs with this camera for the simplicity of capturing and sharing, but I will edit my photos every now and then to remind myself of the power of post-processing and to see what the Fujifilm sensor is really capable of. And also because while I do love a more authentic photo, my wife prefers the edits, and indeed the Fuji sensor is very capable in that regard. For example, while I did like the straight out of camera shots at this pumpkin patch with the Fuji X Weekly Kodak Gold 200 recipe, I think my edits in post did better with skin tones and brought out a little more color. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of the flexibility of this camera. It's the best of both worlds. Great straight out of camera, great when editing the raw image. Call it the honeymoon phase if you want, but look, I just love so many of the photos I've created this year with the X100VI, no matter the circumstance. Even in low light, with the noise reduction set all the way down to -4, the JPEGs out of this camera sensor do a really great job handling noise. But all of that said, and with all of the praise that I've just heaped upon the X100VI, there's still one thing to address when it comes to image quality, and it may be the most subjective of all. What is the reaction to these photos? If you're someone who's sharing on social media or mixing them in with client work, how will the viewer react? I mean, yeah, it's kind of a vain and superficial question, but if we weren't concerned with how our photos were received, we wouldn't be sharing them on social media or with family and friends. So yeah, what's the reaction to my photography with the X100VI or the Sony A7 IV? Honestly, if it's a great photo, it's a great photo. Most won't notice the difference between cameras, especially if I'm editing the final photo from a raw image. And if you know what you're doing in terms of composition and lighting, you can make up for the lack of background separation and detail that the smaller sensor is missing, especially when you're closer to your subject. But I gotta say, when you're shooting with a full frame camera, and it all comes together, and in the case of how I use my A7 IV, taking the image into Lightroom and further enhancing it, I think that's the magic. And that's where you may notice the limitations to some of your APS-C RAW files compared to full frame in terms of dynamic range. Yeah, I know shooting wide open all the time doesn't necessarily make for a great photo, but I'll be damned if it doesn't make your photo stand out, and especially at a 35mm focal length, still considered wide-ish, that extra bit of bokeh does turn heads, and it's something that the X100VI doesn't always do quite as well as a full-frame camera. So, I've thrown a lot out here, probably too much, and given my opinions on a lot of different parts of these cameras and the experience of shooting with them, but where do I stand on the X100VI as a whole? Well, I absolutely believe it lives up to most of the hype. I said at the beginning, the conversation with this camera starts with size, and that's where I'm ending it here as well. At this size, there's not another camera that gives you what the X100VI does. If you're fine with an APS-C sensor and a fixed lens, and a lot of people are, even regular full-frame shooters are, then I think you're gonna love this camera. Don't buy the X100VI will make you a better photographer, or the X100VI has changed my life hype. That stuff is for headlines and clicks. What this camera probably will do is lead you to take more photos, since if you're like me, you'll want to shoot with it as much as you can, almost daily. And I would say that is the mark of a great camera. We can poke holes in any camera and find flaws, especially if you're looking at cameras in this $1,500 to $2,500 price range. They'll have great tech, but they'll also still be missing some of the top-end hardware and features because camera companies don't want to undercut the sales of their high-end and flagship cameras. And full disclosure, I actually started working on this video while I was in the midst of picking up my A7 IV for casual photography again. So the full frame versus APS-C debate has really been staring me right in the face. But at the end of the day, the convenience and small form factor that weigh heavily into the overall shooting experience just win for me. The X100VI goes everywhere. It can capture anything, and it's the most fun I've had with casual photography. Please let me know what you guys think, and let's get the debate going in the comments a little bit. Am I just drinking the Kool-Aid, or is the X100 series really the almost perfect daily carry? Thanks as always for watching this one, and I'll see you in the next video.